I suppose every man believes he knows his wife. After 14 years of marriage, I thought I knew Olivia better than she knew herself. I was wrong about everything. My name is Benjamin Cross, and this is the story of how my comfortable life unraveled in the most public way possible. It's a story about betrayal, yes, but more than that. It's about discovering that the person sleeping beside you for over a decade can become a stranger without you even noticing. The morning it all started to come apart was a Tuesday in March. I remember because I was reviewing quarterly sales reports when Richard Brennan dropped the bomb that would detonate my entire world. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me start at the beginning, when everything still made sense. Olivia and I met at a marketing conference in Chicago 15 years ago. She was coordinating the event, moving through the crowds with a tablet and headset, solving problems with the kind of effortless competence that caught my attention immediately. I was there representing industrial equipment sales, not exactly the most glamorous field, but steady work that paid well. She was beautiful in an understated way. Auburn hair that caught the light, green eyes that seemed to see everything, and a smile that made you feel like you were the only person in the room. When I finally worked up the courage to ask her to dinner, she said yes with a laugh that I would remember for years afterward. "You're not going to bore me with equipment specifications, are you?" she asked over appetizers at a small Italian place near the convention center. "Only if you want to hear about the revolutionary new hydraulic systems we're launching next quarter," I replied, and she laughed again. We talked until the restaurant closed. She told me about her work in marketing, her dreams of starting her own consulting firm, her love of yoga and travel. I told her about my territory, my clients, my modest ambitions of regional management. We were both 30 then, old enough to recognize something real when we found it. The courtship was traditional. Long phone calls, weekend visits between Chicago and Milwaukee, carefully planned dates that gradually became more frequent. When I proposed 11 months later, she said yes without hesitation. We married in a simple ceremony at her parents' church, honeymooned in Ireland, and settled into the kind of life that people call comfortable. I bought a house in Brookfield, a established neighborhood with good schools, even though we hadn't started talking about children yet. Olivia gave up her marketing job and started teaching yoga part-time, saying she wanted something less stressful. The transition seemed natural. I was traveling 2 or 3 days a week for sales calls, and having her manage the home front made everything easier. For 13 years, we fell into a rhythm that felt sustainable. I handled the finances, she handled the social calendar. I focused on building my client base, she joined charity boards and neighborhood committees. We went to church on Sundays, took vacation twice a year, and maintained the kind of marriage that people pointed to as stable. The intimacy wasn't passionate anymore, but it was comfortable. We had dinner together most nights when I was in town, watched movies on weekends, and made love with the predictable frequency of long-married couples. If there was a routine to it, that felt like maturity rather than stagnation. Olivia seemed content. She had her yoga classes at the community center, her volunteer work with the Literacy Foundation, her book club on Thursday afternoons. When she talked about wanting to expand her activities, I encouraged her. When she mentioned feeling unfulfilled, I suggested she pursue whatever interested her. I thought I was being supportive. Looking back, I can see that we were living parallel lives rather than intersecting ones. But at the time, it felt like partnership. She managed our social calendar, I managed our financial security. She maintained our community connections, I maintained our income. Division of labor in a modern marriage. The changes started about 8 months before everything collapsed, though I didn't recognize them as warning signs at the time. Olivia began paying more attention to her appearance. New clothes, different hairstyles, a personal trainer at an upscale gym across town. When I complimented her on looking great, she smiled and said she was finally taking care of herself properly. "I've been letting myself go for too long," she said one evening, studying herself in the bathroom mirror after what looked like a professional makeup application. I need to start acting like a woman who values herself. I agreed wholeheartedly. After years of yoga pants and ponytails, seeing her dress up felt like a positive development. When she started buying designer handbags and expensive jewelry, I assumed she was using money from the household account. We had always maintained joint finances, and I trusted her completely with spending decisions. Her schedule became busier too. More charity meetings, weekend workshops, evening events that I wasn't invited to attend. She explained that these were women-only functions or professional development opportunities that wouldn't interest me. When she came home energized and happy from these activities, I was genuinely pleased that she'd found something fulfilling. "You should be proud of me," she said one night after returning from what she called a fundraising gala. She was wearing a black dress I'd never seen before and diamond earrings that caught the light when she moved. "I'm finally contributing something meaningful to the community." "I am proud of you," I told her, and I meant it. She seemed happier than she'd been in years, more confident and engaged with life. If her newfound passion for charity work meant late meetings and weekend commitments, that felt like a reasonable trade-off for having a fulfilled wife. The physical distance between us increased gradually. She started going to bed earlier, saying the volunteer work was exhausting. Weekend mornings that used to begin with coffee and conversation became rushed affairs with her hurrying off to yoga retreats or planning sessions. Even our dinner conversations became shorter, with her checking her phone frequently and offering vague responses to questions about her day. "Sorry, just coordinating tomorrow's event," she would say, typing quickly on her phone while I told her about a client meeting or industry development. This nonprofit work is so much more complex than I expected. I was busy myself during this period, focused on landing a major account with a manufacturing company that could double my commission for the year. The pursuit required extensive travel and late-night preparation, which meant I was often distracted when I was home. Olivia's increasing independence actually made my work easier, eliminating the guilt I might have felt about my own absences. When she started mentioning new people from her charity work, Sarah, who was organizing the silent auction, Jennifer, who was handling corporate sponsorships, Michael, who was advising on legal matters, I was happy she was building a network of like-minded friends. The fact that I never met any of these people seemed natural given our different schedules. "You'd be bored by them," she assured me when I suggested having some of her new friends over for dinner. "They only talk about fundraising strategies and board politics. Not exactly riveting conversation for someone in your field." The expensive purchases became more frequent and more luxurious. Designer shoes that cost more than my monthly car payment. A watch that looked like it belonged in a jewelry store window. Spa treatments that seemed to happen multiple times per week. When I finally asked about the spending, she had explanations ready. "Image matters in this world," she said, adjusting the collar on a silk blouse that probably cost more than most people's entire wardrobe. "If I'm going to represent these organizations effectively, I need to look the part. These donors expect a certain level of sophistication." It made sense. The charity circuit was undoubtedly image-conscious, and if her appearance was helping raise money for good causes, the investment seemed worthwhile. Our finances were solid enough to absorb the additional expenses, and seeing her confidence grow felt worth any temporary budget strain. The Thursday afternoon book club became a particularly important part of her routine. She would spend hours getting ready for these meetings, selecting outfits with the care of someone attending an important business function. When I joked about the literary discussions requiring formal wear, she explained that the group often went to upscale restaurants afterward to continue their conversations. "It's not just about the books," she said, applying lipstick with precision in the entryway mirror. "These women are influential in the community. Building relationships with them opens doors for the charity work." Everything she said made perfect sense. I was proud of her transformation from a somewhat aimless former marketing coordinator into an engaged community volunteer. The fact that this transformation required a significant wardrobe upgrade and busy social calendar seemed like a reasonable evolution. If anything, I felt guilty that my own work demands prevented me from being more involved in her new interests. The changes in our physical relationship were harder to rationalize, but I told myself they were temporary. The new responsibilities were demanding her time and energy, leaving less for intimate moments. When weeks passed without meaningful physical connection, I assumed we were going through one of those phases that all long-term marriages experience. "I'm just so tired lately," she would say when I reached for her in bed. "This fundraising campaign is consuming everything I have. Once we reach our goal, things will get back to normal." I believed her because I wanted to believe her, and because the alternative explanations were too troubling to consider. When you've built a life with someone, when you've made assumptions about their character and your shared future, questioning those foundations feels more dangerous than accepting reasonable explanations for concerning changes. The Thursday that changed everything started like any other. I had a quarterly business lunch scheduled with my regional manager and two colleagues from competing firms. These meetings were partly business, partly social, a chance to maintain industry relationships and share information about market conditions. The venue was Romano's, an upscale restaurant downtown that attracted the kind of professional crowd that conducted business over long meals. Richard Brennan was already at the table when I arrived. He worked for a competing equipment distributor, but we'd known each other for years and maintained the kind of friendly rivalry that benefits everyone in a specialized field. Richard was a gossip who knew everyone in the local business community, the kind of man who collected information like other people collected vintage wine. "Benjamin, good to see you," he said, standing to shake hands. "How's the family? Olivia still involved in all that charity work?" "She's thriving," I replied, settling into my chair. "More active than ever. Sometimes I think she's busier than I am." Richard smiled in a way that seemed slightly knowing, but I didn't think much of it at the time. He was always amused by something, usually information that other people didn't possess yet. We ordered drinks and began discussing territory changes and client developments, the usual shop talk that filled these quarterly meetings. About halfway through lunch, after the second round of drinks and during a lull in business conversation, Richard leaned back in his chair and gave me another one of those knowing looks. "Speaking of Olivia," he said, cutting into his steak with deliberate precision, "I saw her at Fairmont Country Club again last week, with Callahan. They seem to have quite the regular thing going." I stopped with my fork halfway to my mouth. "Fairmont Country Club? Olivia's not a member there." Richard's expression shifted slightly, as if he was realizing that he'd just shared information I didn't already possess. "Oh, well, she's there regularly on Thursdays, always with Charles Callahan. I assumed you knew." Charles Callahan. The name was familiar. A wealthy real estate developer who appeared in the business section of the local paper periodically. "What's she doing with Charles Callahan?" Richard set down his fork and looked uncomfortable for the first time in the 15 years I'd known him. "Listen, Benjamin, I thought you knew about this. Callahan has a reputation. He takes care of several young women around town, provides them with allowances, takes them to nice places. Your wife seems to be part of his regular rotation." The restaurant noise seemed to fade into background static. "His rotation?" "He's got 4 or 5 women he sponsors," Richard continued, his voice lower now. "All married, all looking for a lifestyle upgrade. It's pretty well known in certain circles. I've seen your wife there at least 6 times over the past few months, always on Thursday afternoons, always at his table." My mouth felt dry despite the wine I'd been drinking. "You're saying my wife is having an affair with Charles Callahan?" Richard shrugged uncomfortably. "I'm saying she's part of his collection. Whether you call it an affair or an arrangement, I couldn't tell you. But it's not exactly discreet. Half the club knows about Callahan's girlfriends." The rest of the lunch passed in a blur. I managed to participate in conversation about market trends and client relationships, but my mind was reeling with implications. Olivia's Thursday book club, her expensive new clothes and jewelry, the vague explanations about charity work and fundraising events, the increasing distance between us. After we paid the check and said our goodbyes, I sat in my car in the parking lot for 20 minutes, trying to process what I'd heard. Part of me wanted to dismiss Richard's information as malicious gossip, but he'd been too uncomfortable delivering it to be making it up. He'd clearly expected me to already know about whatever was happening between Olivia and Callahan. I drove back to my office but couldn't concentrate on work. Instead, I found myself researching Charles Callahan online. The man was 62 years old, twice divorced, and worth an estimated $40 million from real estate development. His social media presence showed him at charity galas and art openings, usually accompanied by different attractive women who were identified only as friends in the photo captions. I called Fairmont Country Club and inquired about membership. The initiation fee was $50,000 with monthly dues of $1,200. Not impossible for someone at my income level, but certainly not something I would consider without extensive discussion with Olivia. When I asked about guest policies, the staff member explained that members could bring guests to the dining facilities, but that repeated visits by the same non-member would require special arrangements. That evening, I waited for Olivia to return from her Thursday book club. She arrived home at 7:30, which was consistent with her usual schedule, carrying a novel that looked freshly purchased and wearing an outfit that probably cost more than my monthly salary. "How was book club?" I asked, as she set her purse on the kitchen counter. "Wonderful," she replied, not meeting my eyes. We discussed Jenna's latest novel and went to that new bistro on Water Street afterward. The discussion was so engaging that we lost track of time. "Which bistro?" I asked, though I already suspected the answer wouldn't match Richard's information about Fairmont Country Club. "Harvest Moon," she said without hesitation. "They have an excellent wine selection that paired perfectly with our literary discussion." I nodded and didn't pursue the topic further. There was no point in confronting her with incomplete information, and I needed time to understand exactly what I was dealing with. But as I watched her move through our kitchen, describing fictional conversations about fictional books while wearing clothes purchased with money I hadn't provided, I felt like I was seeing a stranger. That night, I lay awake listening to Olivia breathe beside me and wondering how long this had been going on. 8 months, based on when the wardrobe upgrade started? Longer? Had there been signs I'd missed? Or had she simply become skilled at deception? The next morning, I decided to conduct my own investigation. I called in sick to work and drove to Fairmont Country Club at noon, parking across the street where I could observe the valet area without being obvious. At 12:30, a silver Bentley pulled up and discharged a man who matched Charles Callahan's photos. He was tall, well-dressed, and moved with the confidence of someone accustomed to being important. At 1 o'clock, Olivia's Honda Accord arrived at the valet stand. I watched my wife of 14 years step out of her car wearing a red dress I'd never seen before and walk into Fairmont Country Club like she belonged there. She greeted the valet by name and moved through the entrance with familiarity that suggested this was indeed a regular occurrence. I waited in my car for 3 hours. During that time, I saw Charles Callahan's Bentley remain in the valet area, while other cars came and went. At 4:15, Olivia emerged from the club, kissed Callahan goodbye on the cheek in full view of anyone watching, and drove away in her Honda Accord. The casual nature of their interaction was somehow more disturbing than if I'd witnessed something obviously romantic. This wasn't a passionate affair conducted in secret. This was a routine business arrangement performed in public, with my wife playing a role that apparently everyone except me understood. Over the next week, I made discreet inquiries among my business contacts about Charles Callahan's reputation. The picture that emerged was consistent and disturbing. Callahan was known throughout the professional community as a man who collected attractive married women, providing them with shopping allowances and social access in exchange for companionship and whatever additional services they were willing to provide. "It's not exactly prostitution," explained Jim Morrison, a commercial banker who'd known Callahan for years. More like ongoing arrangements with women who want to live above their means. He takes them to social events, buys them nice things, treats them like girlfriends. Some of it probably crosses physical lines, but the main transaction is financial. And everyone knows about this? I asked. Jim shrugged. It's not exactly a secret. The man's been doing it for years, always with the same type. Married women in their late 30s or early 40s who are looking for an upgrade. He's discreet enough to avoid legal problems, but not discreet enough to avoid social recognition. The humiliation was worse than the betrayal. Learning that my wife was cheating on me was devastating, but learning that her affair was public knowledge among my professional peers was unbearable. How many people at industry events had been looking at me with pity or amusement? How many conversations had stopped when I entered a room? I began paying closer attention to Olivia's behavior and appearance. The expensive jewelry that I'd attributed to her improved taste suddenly seemed like evidence of an ongoing financial arrangement. The confidence and sophistication that I'd celebrated as personal growth now appeared to be the result of being pampered by a wealthy benefactor. When I looked at our joint checking account, I found no evidence of unusual spending. Olivia had been careful not to use our money for her expensive purchases, which meant the funding was coming from elsewhere. The math was simple and sickening. Someone else was paying for my wife's lifestyle upgrade. On the following Thursday, I drove past Fairmont Country Club again and confirmed that Olivia's routine was unchanged. Her car was in the valet area at 1 o'clock, still there at 3 o'clock, and gone by 5. When she arrived home that evening, she told me about another engaging book club discussion and dinner at a restaurant I knew she hadn't visited. The group is becoming so close, she said, hanging up a coat that looked expensive enough to represent a month of my salary. We're discussing expanding our meetings to twice per week. The conversations are just so intellectually stimulating. That sounds wonderful, I replied, watching her move around our kitchen with the satisfied energy of someone who'd spent the afternoon being pampered by a wealthy man. What book are you reading next? She named a popular novel that had been released the previous week, which gave her lie a surface plausibility. But I'd seen the same book in the back seat of her car for 3 weeks, still showing the creases of a volume that had never been opened. The following Friday evening, I decided to confront her directly. I'd spent 2 weeks gathering information and confirming details, and I had enough evidence to make denial impossible. More importantly, I'd had time to process the emotional impact and plan my response. Olivia arrived home at 6:30 from what she described as a charity planning session. She was wearing another outfit I'd never seen before and carrying a small gift bag from an expensive jewelry store. When I asked about the bag, she said it contained a thank you gift from a grateful donor. Olivia, I said, after she'd settled into the living room with a glass of wine, I need to ask you something important, and I need you to give me an honest answer. Something in my tone must have alerted her to the seriousness of the conversation, because she set down her wine glass and gave me her full attention for the first time in months. Richard Brennan saw you at Fairmont Country Club last week, I continued, watching her face carefully. With Charles Callahan. He says you're there regularly, every Thursday afternoon. The color drained from Olivia's face, and she opened her mouth as if to speak, then closed it without making a sound. For a moment, she looked like someone who'd been caught in a crime rather than a wife having a difficult conversation with her husband. I can explain, she finally said, but her voice sounded weak and uncertain. Richard says Callahan has a reputation for sponsoring married women, I continued. That he provides them with allowances and takes them to expensive places. Is that what's been happening, Olivia? Is Charles Callahan paying for your new lifestyle? She started crying then, but they weren't tears of remorse. They were tears of panic, the response of someone who'd been caught in a deception that couldn't be explained away. When she finally spoke, her words confirmed everything I'd suspected, and worse. It's not what you think, she said, though her shaking voice suggested it was exactly what I thought. Charles has been helping me with the charity work. He's been mentoring me in fundraising strategies. By giving you money and expensive gifts? I asked. By taking you to Fairmont Country Club every Thursday while you lie to me about book clubs? The lies collapsed quickly once I started asking specific questions. There was no book club. There were no charity meetings on Thursday afternoons. The expensive clothes and jewelry were gifts from Callahan, along with a monthly allowance of $2,000 that she'd been receiving for 8 months. What exactly does he expect in return for this generosity? I asked, though I dreaded the answer. Companionship, she said, not meeting my eyes. He's lonely, Benjamin. His wives left him because they couldn't handle his demanding schedule. All he wants is someone to have lunch with, someone to attend social events with. He's not asking for anything inappropriate. Inappropriate? I repeated. You've been lying to your husband for 8 months to spend time with another man who's paying you for your company. How is that not inappropriate? As the conversation continued, more details emerged. Callahan maintained arrangements with 4 other married women, all of whom attended social events with him on a rotating schedule. Olivia was his Thursday companion, responsible for accompanying him to lunch and whatever evening functions were scheduled that day. The arrangement included a monthly stipend, shopping allowances, and gifts that were selected to maintain her appearance at the level he expected. And the physical aspect? I asked. She hesitated before answering. He's affectionate but not demanding. Sometimes he wants to hold hands at events or have me sit close to him during dinner. Nothing that crosses serious lines. Nothing that crosses serious lines? I could hear my voice getting louder despite my efforts to stay calm. Olivia, you're describing a relationship where another man pays you to pretend to be his girlfriend. How is that not crossing serious lines? Her justifications became increasingly desperate as the conversation progressed. She claimed that Callahan was helping her develop professional skills that would benefit her future career. She insisted that the arrangement was temporary, just until she established herself in the non-profit world. She argued that their marriage had become stagnant and that her new confidence was actually improving our relationship. Improving our relationship? I asked. When was the last time we had a meaningful conversation? When was the last time you seemed interested in anything I had to say? You're always working, she replied. When you're home, you're checking emails or preparing for the next day. Charles makes time for me. He listens when I talk. He makes me feel valued and appreciated. Because he's paying you for your time, I said. It's easy to be attentive when someone is providing you with a service you're purchasing. The conversation ended with Olivia promising to break off the arrangement with Callahan immediately. She begged me to forgive her, claiming that she'd gotten involved without understanding the implications and that she wanted to rebuild our marriage. She swore that nothing seriously physical had happened and that she'd been motivated by loneliness rather than greed. I wanted to believe her, but the scale of the deception made trust impossible. This wasn't a momentary lapse in judgment or an emotional affair that had spiraled out of control. This was an ongoing business arrangement that she'd maintained through months of deliberate lies, performed in public venues where my professional colleagues could observe her behavior. I need time to think, I told her. And I need you to leave for a few days while I figure out how to handle this. She packed a bag and went to stay with her sister, leaving me alone in a house that suddenly felt like a crime scene. Every expensive item she'd left behind, the designer shoes in the closet, the jewelry on the dresser, the handbags lined up in the hallway, served as evidence of her relationship with another man. Over the weekend, I tried to imagine scenarios where our marriage could survive this betrayal. Could we rebuild trust after such extensive deception? Could I continue living with someone who demonstrated such a capacity for sustained lying? Could our community relationships recover from the public nature of her arrangement with Callahan? The answers became clear when I started receiving phone calls from friends and colleagues who'd heard about the situation. Word travels quickly in professional circles, especially when it involves public behavior at exclusive venues. By Monday morning, it seemed like everyone in the business community knew that Benjamin Cross's wife had been playing mistress to Charles Callahan. I'm sorry you had to find out this way, said Tom Rodriguez, a client who'd become a friend over the years. Several people have mentioned seeing them together over the past few months. We all assumed you knew and were handling it privately. How many people are we talking about? I asked. Anyone who's been to Fairmont or attended the same social events, Tom replied. Callahan doesn't exactly hide his arrangements. It's been pretty obvious that your wife was part of his regular rotation. The humiliation was compounded by the realization that my marriage had become a source of gossip and speculation among people whose professional respect I valued. How could I continue working in this community knowing that everyone understood the situation better than I had? How could I attend industry events where people were discussing my personal life behind my back? When Olivia returned on Tuesday, she seemed to expect that we could somehow move forward together. She'd ended the arrangement with Callahan, she assured me. She was ready to focus completely on rebuilding our marriage. She understood that she'd made terrible decisions and was prepared to do whatever was necessary to regain my trust. It's too late for that, I told her. This isn't just about us anymore. Half the business community knows what was happening. I can't continue living in a place where everyone understands our marriage better than I did. People will forget, she said. These things blow over eventually. People don't forget when someone becomes a public spectacle, I replied. They don't forget when a married woman spends 8 months playing dress-up for a wealthy benefactor while lying to her husband about book clubs. I filed for divorce the following week. The decision wasn't made in anger, though anger was certainly part of my emotional response. It was made from a recognition that trust, once broken this thoroughly, couldn't be repaired. Even if Olivia had been completely honest about the physical boundaries of her arrangement with Callahan, the emotional and financial infidelity was devastating enough to end our marriage. The divorce proceedings were surprisingly straightforward. Wisconsin is a no-fault state, which meant that proving adultery wasn't necessary for legal purposes. But the circumstances of our separation meant that Olivia's bargaining position was severely compromised. Her arrangement with Callahan had ended immediately when our marriage began falling apart, leaving her without income or resources to fight an extended legal battle. Your wife made some interesting financial choices, my attorney observed after reviewing our asset disclosure statements. Apparently, she was receiving significant money from an outside source but chose not to save any of it. All the funds seemed to have been spent on personal items with no lasting value. The house remained mine, since I'd made all the mortgage payments and Olivia had no documented financial contribution to its maintenance or improvement. The joint savings account was divided equally, but the balance was modest since most of our accumulated wealth was tied up in home equity and retirement accounts that she couldn't access. Olivia's attempts to continue her expensive lifestyle without Callahan's support lasted about 6 weeks. The part-time yoga instruction that had been adequate when her needs were minimal became completely insufficient when she was facing independent living expenses. The designer clothes and accessories that had defined her identity during the affair period had no resale value, leaving her with a wardrobe that was impressive but not practical. She's been asking friends for money, my sister-in-law informed me during one of our periodic conversations, claiming that you left her financially ruined and that she needs help getting back on her feet. What kind of response is she getting? I asked. Mixed, came the reply. Some people feel sorry for her, but most are uncomfortable with the whole situation. It's hard to generate sympathy for someone who got caught playing mistress to a wealthy man. The social consequences for Olivia were swift and severe. The charitable organizations where she'd claimed to be volunteering apparently had no record of her involvement, which suggested that her community service had been as fictional as her book club. The women she'd described as close friends from her nonprofit work either didn't exist or distanced themselves quickly when the truth about her situation became public. Fairmont Country Club banned her from the premises, making it clear that guests who caused social disruption weren't welcome. Callahan had already moved on to a replacement companion, a younger woman who was seen at his regular table within 2 weeks of Olivia's departure. The efficiency of his transition suggested that maintaining a stable of attractive companions was a well-organized business operation rather than a series of romantic relationships. The man treats women like interchangeable accessories, observed Janet Collins, a mutual friend who'd known us both for years. When one becomes inconvenient, he simply orders a replacement. Olivia was foolish to think she was special to him. My own social situation improved gradually as people recognized that I'd been the victim rather than the perpetrator of the deception. Colleagues who'd been uncertain about how to handle the awkward situation became more supportive once they understood that I'd been unaware of Olivia's arrangement with Callahan. Industry events that I dreaded attending became opportunities to rebuild professional relationships. "You handled this with a lot of class," Richard Brennan told me at a business conference 3 months after the divorce was finalized. "A lot of men would have made a public scene or tried to cause trouble for Callahan. Taking the high road probably helped your reputation more than it hurt it." The high road hadn't been a calculated strategy so much as the result of being too exhausted by the situation to pursue revenge. Fighting with Callahan would have required energy I didn't possess, and would have kept me connected to a situation I wanted to escape. Getting divorced and moving forward seemed like the most efficient way to reclaim my life. Church attendance became more comfortable as congregation members rallied around someone they viewed as an innocent victim of marital betrayal. The pastor's wife organized a series of dinners designed to help me reintegrate into social activities, and I found myself receiving more invitations than I'd had time to accept, even when I was married. "The community is proud of how you've handled this situation," Pastor Williams told me during one of our counseling sessions. "Maintaining your dignity while going through such a public ordeal takes real character. People respect that kind of strength." My financial situation actually improved after the divorce. Eliminating Olivia's expenses and the mysterious costs associated with her lifestyle upgrade left me with more disposable income than I'd had in years. The house felt larger and more peaceful without the tension that had developed between us during her months of deception. 6 months after the divorce was finalized, I accepted a promotion to regional sales manager that would have been difficult to pursue while managing a complicated marriage. The increased responsibility came with a substantial salary increase and the prospect of relocating to a larger territory where fewer people knew about my personal history. "This is exactly the kind of opportunity you deserve," said my district manager when offering me the position. "You've proven that you can maintain professional standards even when dealing with personal adversity. That's the kind of character we want in management." The new job required relocating to Madison, which felt like an opportunity for a fresh start in a city where my personal history wouldn't be common knowledge. I sold the house in Brookfield and bought a smaller but more modern condo that reflected my new life as a single professional rather than a married homeowner. Dating seemed premature for several months after the divorce, but eventually I began accepting social invitations that included opportunities to meet new people. The experience of having been betrayed so thoroughly had made me more cautious about trusting romantic partners, but it had also clarified what I valued in a relationship. Amanda Pierce was a nurse at the hospital where I'd been receiving treatment for stress-related insomnia. She was 35, divorced herself, and possessed the kind of straightforward honesty that felt refreshing after years of living with someone who'd become skilled at deception. When she asked me out for coffee after one of my appointments, I was surprised by how comfortable the conversation felt. "I heard about your situation from Dr. Martinez," she said during our second date. "Not the details, just that you'd been through a difficult divorce. I hope you don't mind that I know something about your background." "What did he tell you?" I asked. "That you'd been married to someone who wasn't trustworthy, and that you'd handled the situation with more grace than most people would have managed. He said you were a good man who'd been dealt some bad cards." The relationship with Amanda developed slowly, partly because of my newfound caution, and partly because she understood the value of building trust gradually. Her approach to dating was refreshingly direct. She said what she meant, kept the commitments she made, and demonstrated consistency between her words and actions. "I don't have time for games," she explained when I complimented her on her straightforwardness. "Life is too short to spend it pretending to be someone you're not or trying to figure out what someone else is really thinking. 9 months into our relationship, Amanda and I moved in together. The decision felt natural rather than rushed, based on genuine compatibility rather than loneliness or social pressure. Her presence in my life provided a stark contrast to the final years with Olivia, marked by honest communication and shared responsibility rather than secrecy and deception. "You're different from who I expected," Amanda told me one evening as we prepared dinner together in my condo kitchen. "From what I'd heard about your ex-wife's behavior, I thought you might be bitter or suspicious. But you're neither of those things." "Should I be?" I asked. "Some people would be," she replied. "Being deceived that thoroughly would make a lot of men angry at all women. But you seem to understand that what happened was about her character, not about relationships in general." She was right. The experience with Olivia had been painful and humiliating, but it had also been educational. I'd learned to recognize warning signs that I'd missed before. Vague explanations for time spent away from home, sudden changes in spending patterns, and increasing emotional distance. More importantly, I'd learned to value transparency and consistency in ways that I'd previously taken for granted. 2 years after my divorce from Olivia was finalized, I received an invitation to Richard Brennan's retirement party. The event was being held at Fairmont Country Club, which felt like both ironic and appropriate closure to the entire experience. I decided to attend, bringing Amanda as my guest. "Are you sure you want to go back there?" Amanda asked when I told her about the invitation. "Won't that bring up difficult memories?" "Probably," I replied. "But avoiding places because of bad associations gives them more power than they deserve. Besides, Richard's the one who told me what was happening. I owe him some gratitude for that." The party was exactly what I'd expected. Industry professionals celebrating a colleague's career while networking for future opportunities. The venue looked the same as it had during my surveillance visits, but my perspective on it had changed completely. Instead of seeing it as the site of my humiliation, I could view it as the place where my real life had begun. "Benjamin," Richard approached us near the bar, looking genuinely pleased to see me. "I'm so glad you could make it. And you must be Amanda. I've heard wonderful things about you from mutual friends." "Thank you for inviting us," I replied. "This is quite a send-off." "Listen," Richard said, lowering his voice slightly. "I hope you know I took no pleasure in telling you about your wife's situation, but I felt like you had a right to know what people were talking about." "You did the right thing," I assured him. "If you hadn't told me, I might still be living in ignorance while everyone else understood my marriage better than I did." During the party, several colleagues approached me to offer congratulations on my promotion and to introduce themselves to Amanda. The conversations were natural and comfortable, lacking the awkward sympathy that had characterized social interactions immediately after my divorce. Time and my obvious happiness with Amanda had transformed me from an object of pity into someone worthy of respect. "You seem to be well regarded in this community," Amanda observed as we drove home from the party. "A lot of people made a point of telling me how much they respect you." "I think they respect how I handled a difficult situation," I replied. "When someone goes through a public embarrassment with dignity, people remember that." "Do you ever hear anything about your ex-wife?" she asked. "Occasionally," I said. "From what I understand, she moved back to Chicago to live with her parents. The part-time yoga instruction wasn't sufficient to support independent living, and her attempts to find full-time work were complicated by the reputation she developed here." The information about Olivia's post-divorce struggles came from my former sister-in-law, who maintained periodic contact despite the awkwardness of our family situation. According to these reports, Olivia had been unable to rebuild her life effectively after the arrangement with Callahan ended and our marriage collapsed. "She keeps saying that people are judging her unfairly," my former sister-in-law had explained during one of our conversations. "She claims that what happened with Callahan was innocent and that you overreacted to a misunderstanding." 8 months of lying about afternoon book clubs was a misunderstanding? I'd replied. "That's what I told her. but she doesn't want to take responsibility for the choices she made. She's convinced that she was the victim of circumstances rather than the architect of her own problems. This attitude wasn't surprising. Throughout our marriage, Olivia had demonstrated a tendency to rationalize questionable decisions rather than acknowledge their consequences. The affair with Callahan had been the culmination of a pattern rather than an aberration from her normal behavior. 3 years after our divorce, I married Amanda in a small ceremony attended by close friends and family members. The wedding felt like a celebration of authentic partnership rather than social obligation, marked by the kind of transparency and mutual respect that had been missing from my first marriage. I promise to be honest with you even when the truth is difficult, Amanda said during our vows. I promise to respect our relationship enough to communicate directly rather than through deception or manipulation. Her words would have seemed unnecessary to most couples, but they represented essential commitments given my history. The experience with Olivia had taught me that trust, once broken, was nearly impossible to rebuild. But it had also taught me to recognize and value the qualities that make trust possible in the first place. Do you think about your first marriage often? Amanda asked me during our honeymoon in Scotland. Less and less, I replied honestly. When I do think about it, I'm more grateful than angry. If Olivia hadn't made the choices she made, I never would have learned what I actually needed from a relationship. And what's that? She asked. Someone who chooses to be with me rather than someone who settles for me while looking for something better, I said. Someone who values our relationship enough to protect it rather than risking it for temporary advantages. The conversation reminded me that destructive experiences, while painful, can serve as education if approached with the right perspective. Olivia's betrayal had been devastating, but it had also been clarifying. The humiliation of discovering that my wife was essentially a kept woman had been unbearable, but it had also been liberating. 5 years later, Amanda and I are raising 2 children in a house that feels like home rather than a performance space. Our marriage is built on principles that I learned to value through their absence: honesty, reliability, and mutual respect. The experience with Olivia taught me that comfortable relationships aren't necessarily healthy relationships, and that dramatic changes in a partner's behavior are usually symptoms of deeper problems. Daddy, why do you and Mommy always tell each other where you're going? Our daughter asked recently, after listening to Amanda and me coordinate our schedules for the week. Because we're a team, I explained. Team members keep each other informed about their plans so that everyone can make good decisions. Did you do that with your first wife? She asked, with the directness that children bring to complex topics. I thought we did, I replied. But it turned out that she wasn't being honest about her plans. That's why we couldn't stay married. And that's why you married Mommy instead? That's why I was smart enough to recognize how special Mommy is, I corrected. Sometimes difficult experiences teach us to appreciate good things that we might have taken for granted before. The conversation reminded me that the story of my first marriage's collapse wasn't really about Olivia's choices or Charles Callahan's money. It was about learning to distinguish between relationships that appear stable and relationships that actually are stable, between partners who seem committed and partners who actually are committed. Olivia had been an attractive, intelligent woman who was capable of maintaining the appearance of a good wife while pursuing arrangements that served her individual interests. Amanda is an attractive, intelligent woman who chooses to prioritize our shared interests over opportunities that might benefit her individually. The difference isn't obvious from casual observation, but it's fundamental to the quality of daily life. Last month, I received an unexpected phone call from Richard Brennan, now 3 years into retirement, but still connected to industry gossip. He'd heard that Charles Callahan had been arrested for tax evasion related to the business expense deductions he'd claimed for his female companions. Apparently, the IRS decided that paying for girlfriends wasn't a legitimate business expense, Richard explained with evident amusement. The man's been audited for the past 2 years, and they found enough irregularities to file criminal charges. What's the likely outcome? I asked. Prison time, probably, Richard replied, and definitely financial ruin. The man's assets are being seized to pay back taxes and penalties. His days of sponsoring attractive companions are over. I felt no satisfaction at this news, partly because Callahan's legal troubles seemed irrelevant to my current life, and partly because his downfall wouldn't undo the damage he'd caused to other people's relationships. How many marriages had been destroyed by his willingness to provide financial incentives for wives to deceive their husbands? How many men had experienced the humiliation of discovering that their spouses were essentially high-end escorts? Did you ever find out what happened to Olivia? Richard asked. She's living in Chicago with her parents, I replied. Working part-time at a health club, from what I've heard. Still single, struggling financially. Probably for the best, Richard observed. A woman who's willing to lie to her husband for 8 months isn't likely to make a trustworthy partner for anyone else. After ending the call with Richard, I sat in my home office thinking about the irony of Callahan's situation. The man who'd built his lifestyle around manipulating married women through financial incentives was now facing the consequences of trying to manipulate the tax system through fraudulent deductions. There was a certain justice in his downfall, even if it came too late to prevent the damage he'd caused to families like mine. That evening, I told Amanda about Richard's call and Callahan's legal troubles. Her response was characteristically practical. "I'm sorry for his current wife and children," she said. "They probably had no idea what kind of business their husband and father was really conducting." "Do you think I should feel vindicated?" I asked. "Do you?" she replied. "Not really," I admitted. "His problems don't change what happened to our marriage, and they don't undo the public humiliation. If anything, his arrest probably means that more details about his arrangements will become public, which could be embarrassing for the women who were involved with him." "Including Olivia," Amanda observed. "Including Olivia," I agreed. "Though she made her choices knowing the risks. It's hard to feel too sorry for someone who prioritized expensive handbags over marriage vows." The conversation reminded me that forgiveness doesn't require forgetting, and that moving forward doesn't require pretending that past injuries were insignificant. Olivia's choices had caused real damage to real people, and the consequences of those choices were permanent regardless of anyone's legal troubles. As I write this, 7 years have passed since Richard Brennan delivered the news that ended my first marriage. Those 7 years have included professional advancement, geographic relocation, remarriage, and parenthood, a complete reconstruction of adult life based on lessons learned through painful experience. The house where Amanda and I live is smaller than the one I shared with Olivia, but it feels larger because it contains no secrets. Our conversations are longer and more substantial because they're based on actual experiences rather than manufactured stories. Our social life is quieter but more genuine because it involves people who know and accept us as we actually are. "Are you happy?" Amanda asked me recently, after I'd been particularly quiet during dinner with friends. "Completely," I replied, and realized that I meant it in ways that I'd never understood before. The happiness I feel now is different from the satisfaction I'd experienced during the early years with Olivia. It's based on knowledge rather than assumption, on conscious choice rather than comfortable routine. "Even considering everything you went through?" she pressed. "Especially considering everything I went through," I corrected. "Without that experience, I might have taken our relationship for granted. Bad experiences teach you to recognize good ones." This is the lesson that emerged from the wreckage of my first marriage. Some relationships that appear strong are actually fragile, while some that seem unremarkable are actually resilient. The difference isn't always visible from the outside, but it becomes clear when stress tests the foundation. Olivia chose to risk our marriage for temporary financial benefits and social status that she couldn't maintain independently. Amanda chooses to strengthen our marriage by prioritizing long-term stability over short-term opportunities. Both women are intelligent and capable, but their approaches to relationships reflect fundamentally different values. The story of Olivia's affair with Charles Callahan isn't ultimately about money or sex or social climbing. It's about character, and the ways that character reveals itself when people think no one is watching. It's about the difference between partners who view marriage as a commitment to be honored and partners who view marriage as a safety net while pursuing individual advancement. If I could send a message to my younger self, the man who was so pleased with Olivia's transformation and so trusting of her explanations about charity work and book clubs, it would be this. Pay attention to changes in behavior that can't be easily explained, especially when those changes involve money, time, and emotional distance. Trust is important in marriage, but verification is important too. The benefactor's collection, as Richard Brennan called it, was real. Charles Callahan did maintain a stable of attractive married women who were willing to trade companionship and attention for financial support and luxury experiences. The arrangement was conducted openly enough that half the business community knew about it, but discreetly enough that the women involved could maintain plausible explanations for their behavior. Olivia was collected, displayed, and eventually discarded when she became inconvenient. The experience damaged her reputation, ended her marriage, and left her financially dependent on family members who were embarrassed by her choices. The temporary benefits she received, expensive clothes, jewelry, meals at exclusive restaurants, were far outweighed by the permanent costs. For me, the experience was devastating but ultimately educational. It taught me to distinguish between relationships that look good and relationships that are good, between partners who seem committed and partners who actually are committed. Most importantly, it prepared me to recognize and appreciate the genuine partnership I found with Amanda. Every Thursday afternoon when Amanda texts me about her plans for the day or calls to discuss something that happened at work, I remember those months when Olivia was disappearing into lies about book clubs and charity meetings. The contrast reminds me that ordinary honesty is actually extraordinary, and that relationships built on transparency are rare enough to be treasured. This is my story of discovery, loss, and recovery. It's a story about learning that some prices are too high to pay, some risks too great to take, and some people too untrustworthy to marry. But it's also a story about second chances, earned wisdom, and the possibility of building something better from the ruins of something that only appeared to be good. The benefactor's collection has been disbanded, the benefactor himself facing federal prison time, and the collected women dispersed to deal with the consequences of their choices individually. But life continues, relationships heal, and people learn to make better decisions based on painful experience. I am grateful for the difficult education I received, even though I wouldn't wish it on anyone else. Sometimes the most valuable lessons come at the highest cost, and sometimes the worst experiences prepare us for the best outcomes. In the end, losing a marriage built on deception allowed me to build a marriage based on truth, and that exchange was worth every moment of pain along the way.